What happens when armed soldiers ready for war come face to face with a race of unknown cryptids? And then we meet an exorcist who went toe to toe with hell itself and successfully extracted a demon and freed a woman's soul. But that's just the beginning of this story. Because if there's one thing we know, the devil is the master of deception. Today on Dead Rabbit Radio. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Dead Rabbit Radio. Host Jason Carpenter, I'm having a great day. I hope you guys are having a great day too. Hope you guys are having tons of fun and doing whatever you're doing. Hope you guys have some cool plans for the upcoming weekend. I might finally go see that Planet of the Apes movie. I'm dressed up in my ape costume. I'm all running around the theater. I'm like, hey, everybody, movie's 3D. Give me some popcorn. Nah. But somebody who pays for movie tickets and sits comfortably in a seat, someone who doesn't cause chaos wherever he goes, running into Dead Rabbit Radio Command, let's give it up for one of our legacy Patreon supporters, Hoots Cheech. Woohoo, yeah, yeah, it's coming on in to Dead Rabbit Radio Command. Thanks everyone for helping support the show in all the different ways you can. It really, really means a lot. It really means a lot. I know that's not my normal spiel, but tell your friends, tell your family, tell everyone you know. Dead Rabbit Radio is your favorite paranormal show. There we go. So, Hoots Cheech, you're going to be our captain, our pilot this episode. Let's go ahead and get this party started. I'm going to toss you the keys to the Jason Jet. Everybody climb on board as Hoots Cheech takes us up and away out of Dead Rabbit Radio Command. Fly us all the way out to Indochina. Jason Jet's ready for war. This is like a F-14 G.I. Joe jet. We're all crammed into the back seat. There's only 2 seats in the thing. Hoots Cheech is flying us around. We're headed out to Indochina. We're in the 1950s, so the Vietnam War has not started officially. This is when France still controlled the region. That's where we're headed back. There were issues over there. This is around the time of the first Indochina War. This is the first time that the population over there was like, we don't want to be a colony anymore. We're going to try to fight back the French. So tensions were running high. I also want to give a shout out to Sustained Disgust, because I found this story when I was investigating another story. We'll get to that in a little bit, but I was investigating another story from Sustained Disgust's Ultimate Conspiracy Theory Iceberg. It's the best iceberg out there because he included links. No more of just these word salads. He actually tells you where he got the story. I love it. So thanks, Sustained Disgust. Really, really helpful. We're in Indochina, and these French troops, they're like, Sacre bleu, look at all of this swamp they're walking through, and their boots are getting stuck in the mud. Oh, me boots, my mama be so mad, she bought me these boots, Sacre bleu. And the French commander's standing there, and he's like, dude, he sees the guy, he's actually playing in the mud, he's like, oh, I'm gonna get in so much trouble. The pants are all dirty, and the commander's like, why? Your mom's not in the military, so I don't think she's gonna know your boots got money. And also, quit playing in the mud. We're on patrol. And the French troops are walking around. They're like, Mamma mia, yes, we're on patrol now. And one of them twirls around with his rifle. He's like, what? Huh? And they're like, what did you see, bro? What'd you see? And he goes, I saw a big worm. And they're like, so like a garden worm? He's like, no, not a garden worm. That's not a thing either. They're not called garden worms. He goes, no, it wasn't just like a normal worm. You saw this thing was huge. Maybe like, probably the size of my arm. And popped up out of the mud. And then it slithered away. And people are like, oh, that's weird. So they continue to be on patrol. And they really don't think about it, right? Just maybe think your other fellow soldiers going nuts, the stress of looming war. You think he might be losing his mind. But what happened was French troops began to see these things known as the Ingot. Or some sources call them the Lingot. But we'll just stick with Ingot. The Ingot is what they call these burrowing, worm-like creatures. And French troops keep reporting these things. I was out on patrol looking for the bad guys. And then I saw, I saw a worm. The commanders back at home were like, what? A little drawing of a worm and a little note saying it was the size of my arm, sacre bleu. Commanders are like, okay, this is a little weird. They're supposed to be on patrol. They're supposed to be pacifying the locals. Why do they keep talking about worms? Why are we getting all of these reports of giant worms in the area? Not like sandworms from Dune, but still, I mean, if you were walking around and you saw a worm as wide and as long as your arm pop up out of the ground, you're going to report it, right? You're going to tell people. You're going to make sure everyone knew about the giant worms. So eventually, this got to General Jean de Latreille de Tassenguy, who was the supreme commander of the French troops in the area. And he's getting these letters, and he's like, worm, worm, worm. Okay, these ones are just routine patrols, worm, worm. He has all these reports. He's like, so many worms in Indochina. So he eventually says, we got to figure out what's going on here. We got to figure out, if are troops going crazy? Is there an unknown life form? Is it edible? I'm sure was a question that was asked as well. We already eat snails. What would a delicious giant worm taste like? So he dispatched a bunch of scientists to the region. And probably one or two cooks. And they're going around out there, and they start writing back going, hey, yeah, we are hearing these reports about these worms that these troops are finding, but I've never seen one. Scientists would say, we've patrolled the area, we went to where these worm sightings were. We can't find any sign of them. We can't find a worm. We don't even see like the big holes that these worms would be popping out of. We had no idea what they're talking about. Maybe they are going mad. This is all like in early 1950s, but in 1953, now we're in the year 1953, we're in North Vietnam, because Indochina was Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Just one giant region to the French. We're in North Vietnam, 1953. These reports keep pouring in. More and more reports than before. We were out on patrol. We were all armed and ready to fight when all of a sudden, a giant worm. The general would be like, come on, man, I thought we were done with this. I sent the scientists out, they didn't find nothing. I thought we were done with this worm business. The giant worm popped out of the ground. It's just creepy. It's creepy. So the general's like, oh, not this again. And there's more and more reports coming out in this particular area this year. Giant worm, that had gone through his notes. When all of a sudden, the reports stopped. And General Tassenguy goes, oh, okay, well, I guess that's kind of what we wanted. No reports. Because none of it made sense. We sent out people to try to discover them and taste them. They came back empty-handed. And he's like, no more reports of the worms. I guess everything's going great. But then he gets a report going, the reason why there's no reports of worms coming from that area is because we lost an entire regiment. There was a regiment of French troops up there that kept writing you letters. I don't know if they were personally writing, Dear General, today I saw a worm. All the reports stopped because all the men disappeared in that area. There was a French regiment up in this area, and they kept reporting this worm activity, and there's no one up there now. An entire regiment went missing, which back then, I don't know if they change. I think these numbers do change over time, but back then a French regiment was 3,500 men went missing in North Vietnam in 1953. So that became a bit of a side quest for the French military. They have to find these troops. And at this point, the tales of the worms of Vietnam began appearing in French newspapers. First, it was pretty much a military matter. People were probably writing home saying, this is so weird, I saw this giant worm, and the dad of the soldier gets a letter, and he's like, what? What is going on? Why is my son seeing worms? And why is he writing me about it? I know, it's interesting, but weird. It starts showing up in French newspapers, these reports, and then all of a sudden, they stopped covering it as well. For a brief time, newspapers in France started talking about these worms, and then there was just no mention of them after a certain point, which you imagine that the military might have said, quit talking about worms. They're all trying to recruit people. They're like, come to Indochina, young man. You can have an eventful life. And he's like, yeah, I really want to sign up, but the worm thing. I really want to hang out with a bunch of giant worms. I don't have a problem going over there and stomping through the jungle. But worms? No, thank you. So eventually the military, that'd be my guess, the military made the newspaper stop talking about worms. Now, very famously, eventually, the Vietnamese straight up pulled to George Washington and said, we're going to be our own country. We're going to throw off the shackles of colonialism. We're going to become our own nation. And France goes, I don't know about that. And then after a series of wars and all of these battles, the French said, hey, America, can you help us out over here? They're communists. And America's like, bags are packed, and they come on over. Which, from what I understand, Ho Chi Minh, the leader of North Vietnam, thought that we would back him. Because he goes, hey, we're just like you guys. We're throwing off the shackles of colonialism. America will totally have our back. We're just like George Washington, and America started bombing them, and thus the Vietnam War started. Vietnam conflict, technically no war was declared, but very famously, U.S. troops came over there. It became a very long war, quagmire. But there were no reports from U.S. soldiers about worms. To be fair, they had a lot of other stuff going on, right? So here's a little side note to this whole thing. What happened was Sustained Disgust posted on his Iceberg, and I might get the details a little out of order here because it's been a while, but Sustained Disgust posted on his conspiracy theory Iceberg, which I will put in the show notes here because people love to look at it. It's fantastic. About a woman who was out at a trash dump site because she had this thing about, I think it was collecting neat glass bottles, like old-timey glass bottles. She'd go out to these dump sites, and at this particular site, it may have even been in Oregon, if I remember correctly. I'll put the whole episode in the show notes, but she encountered a giant worm, a worm the size of a human arm. And so, of course, you want to figure out, what could this be? What could this have possibly have been? And I don't remember if I got this part of the story specifically from Sustained Disgust's Iceberg or what, but it led me down a rabbit hole where I started looking up stories of giant worms, and I was either following links or figuring them out myself. I don't remember exactly. But I came across a forum called Above Top Secret, and that is where they start talking about the ingots, where someone posts the story I basically told you, saying, hey, there were these things in Vietnam that were similar to what this woman had seen at a trash dump. Could this have been the same thing? Are these giant worms still around? It is interesting to note that there are very little references outside of pretty much one or two websites, AboveTopSecret.com, and then a forum on forums.fortania.org. That's a word I'm not familiar with. I know what Fortean is. Forteana? Anyways, it'll be a link in the show notes. There's very, very few references to this ingot, this worm-like creature that may have been responsible for the disappearance of 3,500 soldiers. That's it, right? That's all the evidence, or that's all that we have. We don't really have much evidence outside of a couple people saying, I've heard this. I did try looking it up. There is no report of 3,500 troops disappearing in North Vietnam. We did have 151 French soldiers who went missing during Operation Mouette. That was a huge operation spread over 2 months during the First Indochina War. So, most likely captured, lost in the jungle, died due to misadventure, things like that. There's no reports saying that all 151 men went missing at the same time. Just that after the dust had cleared, 151 soldiers were unaccounted for. So there's no record of 3,500 troops missing. But I will say this is a very, very interesting conspiracy theory. It crosses that line, right? It's cryptid and it's conspiracy theory. Because if the French government covered this up, now it's a conspiracy. And is that what happened? They do say that these stories of the ingots popped up in these French newspapers. I wasn't able to find any record of that. But again, French newspapers in the 1950s, even if they were digitized today, and you could search them online, they may not even use the word ingot. And what is the French word for worm? Le worm? So this is something that you guys might be able to do a little more digging into. And I do find it fascinating. We have come across, one of my favorite conspiracy theories is the Paris time gap. It is a conspiracy theory that is very famous in Russia and Eastern Europe, but it's almost unheard of outside of there until we covered it on this show. But it's a story about Paris, basically, that all the clocks stopped and everyone in the nation woke up at the same time and began vomiting. If I remember correctly, there was a time displacement for the entire city of Paris. Now, you can barely find any resources on it. And the ones you do tend to be referencing very obscure articles or just a few stories written here and there. And I'm wondering if the ingots are like that too. I wonder if there is a part of the world that this story is super popular in, but it's just not been translated to English. It could completely be made up for sure, but it could be something that actually happened that has been spoken about. It's never really been widespread in the English-speaking world. I don't know. I think if you did lose 3,500 troops, you probably wouldn't say that. You definitely wouldn't say that if you thought worms were responsible. So if you lost 3,500 men, and especially if you didn't know how they were gone, you would have to account to those families of what happened, but you would just say your son died in combat, or your son died in combat, we haven't been able to retrieve the body, whatever it was. You wouldn't say, well, lovely garden you have, miss, do you hate worms? And they're like, what? If you have a lovely garden, you must hate worms. Well, let me tell you, your son and 3,499 other soldiers may have fallen afoul of this burrowing giant worm. You'd be like, what in the world are you talking about? Rather than, your son died in combat, here's a flag. Here's a French flag. I don't know if they do that in other countries where you get the flag. But anyways, interesting. Super interesting. If this story is real, then we'd be looking at probably the biggest death toll ever ascribed to a cryptid. Even if this story was half true, let's say the regiment was a little exaggerated, let's say it was 1,000 men, that's still a lot. And I'd argue, even if it was 151 men being killed by these giant worms, that would still probably... I mean, we're talking Mothman levels at that point. I guess Mothman has caused enough disasters to rack up a body toll like that, but most cryptids don't kill in mass. Or really at all. Chupacabra, kills chickens and stuff like that, goats, but... Crazy story. I'm sure there's other information out there. If you guys would want to keep looking into that, I would love that. But I kind of just ran into a brick wall. And it's funny because I was just investigating the trash monster one. The trash worm, and came across this. And I don't know if I talked about this in the trash episode. I think I did, but there is a worm-like amphibian called a Caecilian that they can grow up to 5 feet long. It's not an actual worm. It's a worm-like amphibian. They're native to Southeast Asia, South America, Central America, and Mexico. And these guys have their own Wikipedia page. These things are not cryptids. They do exist. And what happens is, even though they exist, there's still rumors about them. Yeah, a 5-foot. First off, you'd think it was just a giant worm if you saw a 5-foot worm slithering out of a hole. They tend to hide in junk piles, which is why that might have been what the woman saw in that trash worm story. She may have seen one of these things. It would have been pretty far up north. If it was in Oregon, I think that's where it happened. Or near water, they'll run into these things. But the fact that they're native to Southeast Asia and then Central South America, Mexico, it's possible that these are what the troops were seeing were these Caecilians, which you would describe as a giant worm. You wouldn't go, well, clearly that is an amphibian. You can tell from the gills, or not gills, whatever an amphibian has or doesn't have. Even though they're a real creature and they exist in these cultures, there are rumors about them. In Mexico specifically, the rumor is these giant worms will hide underground until you're walking down the street and you see like a stream of water and you're like, oh, I really have to go to the bathroom. But my bathroom's across the street. You're all waving to your family. They're like, come back in. You can use the toilet here. Nah, I'm good. I'm just going to poop in the river. Like God intended. There's a rumor, this is where it's a real creature, but people can still have these fears that if your pants are pulled down and you're pooping, or you're just walking around naked, or you forgot your pants or whatever led up to this, and a Caecilian sees you, they'll climb up your butthole. So, I mean, definitely a shock, right? You're like, 5 feet of worm slithering through your body. You're going to have pretty bad days. It's not going to be fun for the Caecilian either. Eventually he's going to get stuck somewhere. But that is a urban legend around these things. It's probably a way to keep people from taking their pants off near junk piles or by the river. But they don't actually climb up people's buttholes, but that is a rumor about these things. So, an unknown cryptid? Were the Ingots actually something different than the Caecilians? Or was it the exact same thing, where people reporting a biological creature that still, for the most part, most people don't even know these things exist. And if you told someone there's a worm, I saw a worm that was 5 feet long, they would think you were making it up. But we know there's at least one creature that looks like a worm that's 5 feet long. We don't know entirely if they climb up people's buttholes. That is not something I'm willing to test. But is that what they found in Indochina, or was it a separate, more vicious form of this same creature? The world may never know. The world may never know until you go to Vietnam yourself and research this, walk around with your pants off, take one for the team, find out if these things... Well, we know the Caecilians are real, but find out about the butt thing, and then maybe if they devour you as they're eating you, write us a note, send us a text. So we know that this is actually a different type of worm over there. One that could easily make 3,500 men disappear off the face of the earth. Hoots Cheech, I'm going to go ahead and toss you the keys to the world-famous Carpenter copter we are leaving behind Vietnam. Fly us all the way out to El Salvador. We're headed all the way out to El Salvador, the home away from home of Dead Rabbit Radio. Very often, it depends on the week, but very often Dead Rabbit Radio is the #1 science podcast in El Salvador. So that is amazing. I always love that. That is my go-to selling point for this show. I find that so awesome. And I've never been there. I think it'd be cool. I want to visit your Bitcoin city when it's been built. But for now, we're going to El Salvador, and we're going quite a few years back. Not 50 or 100 years, but, we don't have an exact time period, but probably around like 10, 15 years ago, I think is a safe bet. We're going to El Salvador, and we're about to meet this guy. His name is Rene Trigueros Hernandez, a.k.a. Rene Huzo. This is what he really goes by. This is what he prefers. Rene has an opportunity of a lifetime. Rene was invited to become part of this exorcism. There was a local woman who had been possessed by a demon. Rene and 11 other men began performing this ritual where they held her down and began praying over her. She's fighting it. Like most demonic possessions, the demon does not want to leave her body. And they're having to hold her down, and she's fighting it. Well, the demon's fighting it. The demon doesn't want to leave. For 6 hours, these 12 men are praying over her, trying to get the evil to leave this woman alone, to loosen its grasp on this poor young woman. 6 hours long this exorcism is going on, and at a certain point, the men begin to see that her stomach starts to inflate. It's getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and they keep praying. They know that it's working. This shouldn't be happening. This woman's stomach shouldn't balloon out the way that it is. They can tell that they're this close to freeing this woman from this demonic influence. They continue to pray, and then they start to see movement. They start to see something kind of moving underneath her clothes. I'm assuming she's wearing a dress. Okay? Because it's going to get gross. The path of least resistance would be a dress. They're holding her down, and they start to see this movement underneath her dress, and that is when a foot-long lizard begins to crawl out of her vagina. It's slowly emerging from her body and slithering its way out of her. And they go, we should catch that thing, right? We're supposed to catch that. That's a gross lizard. It's probably a demon in a lizard form. So they snatch it. They grab that lizard. They grab him, and the woman is free of the curse. The demonic possession is ended. This lizard has left her body. They didn't say what they did with the lizard. I'm assuming they immediately killed it. Chop its head off was what I would do. And then bury it. Something, right? Want to be like, oh, taking you to the zoo. Taking you to the zoo. You can be your own exhibit, little lizard man. Now, I'm sure that they killed it, but they don't say for certain. But anyways, after this lizard crawled out of this woman, this 1 foot long lizard, everything was great. She was saved. The men were happy. They were relieved. The power of God saved this woman's soul. Let's fast forward. It's September 2021, and we're in San Jose, California. At this point, and some of this stuff may have been true back then, but at this point, Rene was a minister. He was a very charismatic, very well-liked Pentecostal minister living in San Jose, California. He may have been a minister back then. He may have just had a passion for ministry, but didn't actually have but wasn't an ordained minister. I'm not for sure, because that's the thing. The story, there's some details that we don't have, and then there are other parts where we have too many details, and we'll get into that in a second. It's horrible, but whether he just had a zest for the religious back in El Salvador, or if he actually was an ordained minister there as well. In September 2021, he was an ordained minister in the Pentecostal church in San Jose, California. He's 59 years old. And he has this one-room church that's held within a converted garage. Just one-room church, the way a lot of Protestant churches start off, and a lot of just remain that way as well. I've attended quite a few churches, the single-room church growing up, and sometimes it was just like a room in a house. But I never Pentecostal church. But anyways, that's just normal. That's not the weird part of the story. It might be weird to someone who's not religious. They're like, what? The church is inside a garage? That's kind of weird. It's totally normal in the world of Protestants. But Rene is this very well-liked, beloved minister. He is the head of a church called Apostles and Prophets Church. He ends up getting contacted by his own kids. You know, they all live in the same area, but he hears from his daughter, Claudia Hernandez, and his son, Rene Hernandez Santos. Claudia is a young mother. She's 25 years old, and she comes to her dad and she goes, Dad, something horrible has happened. I think my daughter, I think she's possessed. I think she has a demon in her. Renee goes, well, why do you think this? And she goes, well, her daughter, who's named Arlie Naomi Proctor, she's 3 years old. Claudia goes, my daughter won't stop screaming. She's sitting there and she's just screaming nonstop. She's crying. I can't soothe her. I can't figure out what's wrong. But she just won't stop screaming. It just breaks my heart to see her like this. Renee goes, that is troubling. That is troubling. It may not necessarily be demonic. It may not be a possession. We'll have to take a look at her. And Claudia's like, yeah, obviously, like, you have more experience with this. You actually performed an exorcism all those years ago. Renee's like, yeah, I've done this before. If she is possessed, we can take care of this. Claudia said that she thinks this whole thing started because her daughter, her 3-year-old daughter, saw something on Claudia's phone. She goes, I believe my daughter saw something sinister on my phone. And that's what caused her to be possessed. Now, we don't know what Claudia's alluding to there. Did she watch a YouTube video? Was there a photo on there? Or what? Did she go to a website that wasn't appropriate for anybody, let alone a 3-year-old kid? I don't know. Those details are lost. But Claudia says that her daughter saw something quote-unquote sinister on her phone, and ever since then, she seems to be possessed. So Renee tells his daughter, Claudia, she's 25, his son, Rene Hernandez, is 19. He tells them, bring Arlie to the church. We will perform an exorcism. I've done it before. And I was able, along with the help of others, but we were able to get this demon to leave this woman's body. And I believe I can do it again. I believe that I have the power of God on my side. They take her to the garage, the converted garage where Apostles and Prophets Church is held. This is where it gets rough, guys. This is where it really gets rough. So, if you want to bow out. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I think this does need some setup. The first thing they did was, Renee goes, stop feeding her and give her very little water. Very, very little amount of water. I don't know if this is a way to weaken the human body to try to get the demon out. But he says, stop feeding her. Give her a little bit of water. And they do that for about the first 12 hours. And then he says, bring her to the church. Bring her to the church. And when they get there, they begin the exorcism. Renee has stated that this demon inside this girl was so strong, was so incredibly strong that he had to take extreme measures to save the soul of his granddaughter. You know what? To be honest, here, man, I hate this. I hate doing stuff like this because obviously, if we're covering true crime, which is where this story's going, I don't want to go too much into details. Let's just basically say that it's funny if I go into too little details, then you imagine the worst. They tortured her. Okay, not Saw level, not Hostel level torturing her, but they did things that you shouldn't even do to an adult body, to anybody. They basically, I mean, to make a long story short, they were trying to get her to vomit. Renee felt that if he could make her vomit, it would get the demon out of her. So they began doing things to try to get her to vomit, and they continued to do these things for 12 hours. Until eventually, Arlie stopped struggling because she died. She died. So I'm going to not go into all the details with that stuff. It's quite disturbing. They end up calling the authorities. Once they realize that she's dead, they call the authorities. They come out. Her body is taken away. And the official cause of death is asphyxiation. And then, nothing happened. Nobody was arrested. Nobody was charged with the murder of this little girl. The police just walked away from it all. That happened in September of 2021. We fast forward to May 2022, and this same church is under investigation because 2 other members of the church, it wasn't any of this trio, 2 other members of the church kidnapped a 3-month-old boy. I think it was like what did they call it? Like a domestic kidnapping type of thing? Like they knew or they were related to the victim. 2 members of the church conspired to kidnap a 3-month-old boy. They do cause the kidnapping. When police are investigating the kidnapping, they come to the church. The baby is totally fine. The 3-month-old baby was like completely unrelated. It was not exorcism related. It didn't involve Renee and his 2 kids. The police come and investigate the kidnapping. They find the baby totally healthy. And now the newspapers find out about the child who was murdered there just last year, back in September. And the question on everyone's mind is, well, why haven't you arrested them? You knew about that? They called the authorities. The little girl's body was taken away. The police were informed. Why weren't they arrested? And the police have never given a reason as to why they were not arrested. They did arrest them in May of 2022. They go, because the public outcry. It was like, wait, this church is involved in an exorcism that killed a child and they weren't arresting the cops. They're like, oh, yeah, totally. We're going to arrest them now. And what's interesting about this story is a couple things. The reason why I wanted to tell it, because, I don't like dwelling on the real-life murders of children. I don't want to go into all the details of what they did. But the trio, if this makes a difference, they feel bad about what happened. In a way, they do. In a way. Let me read you this quote from Renee. He goes, quote, "If you read the Bible, you'll see that Jesus casts away demons and made sick people healthy again. It's not me. It's not when I want to do it. It's when God, in His will, wants to heal the person. The preacher is like an instrument of God. What we do is what God says." It's difficult for people to understand what happened. It's the stuff of God, and everything is in the will of God, no matter how small or big. So he feels bad about it. The mother, she lost her son. The brother lost his niece, and Renee lost his granddaughter. But it's more than just lost her. They all played a part in her being murdered. That's what this was. And he mourns the death of the child, but even then he's like, well, it's not that I wanted to do it. This was God directing me to do it. None of these people, so remember, this happened back in 2021. They were arrested in 2022. As far as I can tell, none of them have been sentenced yet. Now we're in 2024. They're facing 25 years to life, which is murder charges, right? That's pretty standard for a murder charge. I'm doing one last double check, but throughout I don't see really any follow-up since 2022 after they were charged initially. Let me see if I can do a deeper dive using my Google Foo. Change the range. Let's just see what pops up in the past year. Yeah. As far as I can see, there hasn't even been a trial yet. They've been charged. I don't even think they're in jail. Something does seem to be going on the law enforcement side of this. They don't seem to be taking it particularly seriously. You can't even use, there was a period of time during COVID where we saw people committing crimes and then they weren't being tried right away. This is post-COVID. It's been 2 years, 3 years almost since she was been murdered. About 2 years since they were arrested. No sentencing, no court date yet. So I don't know why the San Jose police are dragging their feet on this one. They didn't arrest him even. They didn't charge him when they found out about the death. The asphyxiation, that's not a natural death. It's not like she swallowed a Lego. They snuffed the life out of her with their bare hands. The reason why I wanted to tell this story, is tragic and heartbreaking as it is that I think it does profile an interesting thing. I'll put my cards on the table here. I do believe in the paranormal. I do believe in demonic possession. I think that the story in El Salvador might have happened. I think it is possible for demons to possess people. I think it is possible for bizarre things to happen during exorcisms. I know that sometimes they're more simple than having 12 people hold a woman down and a foot-long lizard crawl out of her. But sometimes they do, the exorcism itself breaches through the veil and becomes high strangeness. You have this bizarre stuff happening during an exorcism. I believe that the woman in El Salvador was possessed. I don't believe that the 3-year-old girl was. I think sometimes, I feel the devil's biggest weapon against mankind is pride. It's ego. If Renee never was in that room back in El Salvador and was part of that team, none of this, I don't think, would have ever happened. I think to engage in one-on-one or 12-on-1 warfare against the demon and to come out on top makes you pretty much as close to a superhero that you can get in the real world. You fought a entity that existed before time did. A fallen angel. A creature of such immense power. Taken down by God's lowly servants here on earth. And I think that my read could totally be wrong, right? I don't know this Renee guy, but I could see this type of thing happening. You come out with such a W from that. You've actually defeated an agent of chaos. You thrust it out of this woman's body. You saved her life. You saved her soul. You don't walk away from that unchanged. You don't walk away from that thinking, sure, God had a hand in that, but I am a tool of God. I'm not just an ordinary person on earth. He worked through me to destroy this evil. Pride. You feel like you can do anything. You defeated the manifestation on evil. You defeated a manifestation of evil on earth. I'm sure he told this story, right? If I was part of an exorcism, if I was part of that first exorcism, not the second one, but if I experienced something like Renee, I would definitely tell people about that. And people would go, wow, that's amazing. You actually helped this woman become free of demonic influence. So when the opportunity to save another life, the life of your own flesh and blood, your grandchild, Renee may have stepped up to that plate without a second thought in the world. He'd already done it. This is nothing. This will be easier, honestly. It's just this little girl. I'll be able to get this demon out of her, and I'll have another W for me and for God. I am nothing but a vessel for God's will. But how many people can even claim that? I was walking the other day, and I was thinking to myself, and I go, I know that God knows who I am. And I know that God knows who you are. God knows who everybody is. But Does the devil know who I am? I just had this thought popped into my head. I go, probably not. I don't think I've even popped up on his radar, which is good, which is a good thing, right? Taking that as a W. I don't think the devil knows who I am. I don't think he knows the name Jason Carpenter. I don't think even if he did come across that in a report one day, I've had encounters with demons. I'll put those episodes in the show notes. But the devil himself, it'd be the same thing. Imagine if you were such an awesome soldier. Your reputation on the battlefield was so well known that Saddam Hussein knew who you were when he was still alive, back in the 90s. Imagine if a world leader goes, oh, it's not that guy again, is he? Oh, double the troops. No, triple them. Unleash the butt worms. We have to stop him before he gets to my residence. I don't think the devil knows who I am. Devil may not know who you are. I would assume probably not. But God knows who everybody is. So that's kind of just like a gimme, right? He knows everybody. But the devil probably only knows of a few people. People he works with and people who he is afraid of. I think Renee was on that level where he felt he had this power beyond other men. Most people, I wouldn't be able to actually perform an exorcism. I don't have any skill in it. I honestly couldn't pray for 6 hours straight. He could. He could be part of this. And I think that pride led him instead of... Because see, the Pentecostal church has said, we do not do exorcisms on the regular. We definitely do not do exorcisms on kids. This was actually a real localized thing. Other churches in the area were like, when they found out about this months later, they went, oh my God, we don't do that. Nobody should do that. And I think in almost any other situation, this would not have happened. Had Renee not successfully been part of an exorcism years ago, when his daughter came and said, I think my daughter's possessed, he would have taken it to other ministers. He would have taken the situation to other ministers and tried to get some feedback. And they'd probably be like, well, we're not going to do an exorcism because she's too young. Let's see what else we can do. I don't know. Take her to the hospital. See if she has some sort of medical issue that's causing her to scream and cry. Try to figure out what it is. If he had these other people that he could count on, which he did, there was a community there. But because he believed he could do this, because he believed he knew how to do it and he had done it before, he was going to do it now and he was going to save his daughter's soul. Instead, he killed her. He killed her. And this is a story of pride getting in the way of wisdom. So really the way I was looking at this story was, it's possible that the exorcism in El Salvador was real and almost like a setup to cause an event like this in the future. I've said this before, the devil and demons, they play the long game. It's not about destroying humanity tomorrow. It's about destroying individuals over a course of time. Ruining families, ruining futures, all of that. They play a long game. And that might have been what happened here. One demon was exorcised out of one woman. But that was all just the setup to get Renee and probably these other 11 men who were there during that original exorcism to believe that they had more power than they actually had. And was going to lead them to make these dark decisions later in life. These murderous actions in the name of God years later. They're all facing jail time. Who knows if they'll ever even be taken to trial. I don't know what's taken so long. It's like playing chess. The devil may sacrifice a pawn, knowing he can just wipe the board clean on the other side. He set him up. He gave Renee that pride in his heart, which not only led to Renee's downfall, to the church's downfall, but resulted in the murder of a little girl. A demonic chain of events that destroyed a church, shattered a family, and most importantly, took the life of a 3-year-old girl. A terrible tragedy. Pride may not be the worst sin in the world, but it is the one that nearly all of us can fall victim to. deadrabbitradio@gmail.com is going to be our email address. You can also hit us up at facebook.com/deadrabbitradio. TikTok is at deadrabbitradio. Dead Rabbit Radio is the daily paranormal conspiracy and true crime podcast. You don't have to listen to it every day, but I'm glad you listened to it today. Have a great one, guys.